Is anybody out there? Anybody?
We are College Hill Farm. Welcome back to College Hill Farm. Today we're continuing our series on casual and complementary prepping, and we're starting to look at more advanced prepping. We did the basics. We talked about an asteroid strike. Today we're going to talk about nuclear incidents. In other words, we're going to talk about things like nuclear blasts, explosions, or nuclear accidents, so that we can get things the way where we have the same talking points. Let's take a look and see what that means to us. Okay, folks, let's talk about the dangers in a modern diverse world of nuclear incidents. Now, we're talking about nuclear incidents like nuclear attacks where there's a bomb. We're talking about dirty bombs, and we're talking about nuclear accidents like at nuclear reactors and things like that. There could be a nuclear incident in our modern world at any time that could expose us to radiation. Now, I'd like to dispel some myths as we go through and talk about the truths about the way things really are. A lot of folks think that the comic books and the movies and that stuff have nuclear pretty well laid down. Well, you know, most of the time they're way wrong. So let's look at what we are talking about nuclear in a modern diverse world. The first thing we'll talk about is nuclear war. So, modern nuclear war is different from nuclear war in 1945. In 1945, the United States is the only country that dropped an atomic bomb on another nation. We dropped an atomic bomb in August of 1945. Its name was Little Boy. And we dropped it on Hiroshima, Japan on August the 6th. And the population of Hiroshima at that time was 345,000 people. Little Man yielded an effective blast equivalent of 12 to 14,000 tons of dynamite. It was a low-air detonation, probably about 1,500 feet. Everything underneath it for a 1.6 kilometer radius was completely destroyed. Just boom, gone. Didn't exist anymore. There were a couple of bunkers that were left. It lit a firestorm that extended out from the center to a diameter of 2 miles. Now, there were 6,000 people that survived the blast but died of gamma radiation a short time after. It's estimated to have killed 166,000 people by either blast or radiation by the end of 1945. There were a lot of long-term effects, especially leukemia. It was a constant for the inhabitants. It started going up about 2 years after the attack and peaked about 6 years later. Children were especially prone to getting leukemia. Later, in about 10 years, the cancer rate for adults really started going up too. Now, the worldwide nuclear arsenal is about 13,355 nuclear bombs that we know about. Russia, the U.S., France, United Kingdom, Pakistan, India, Israel, China, and North Korea all have a nuclear arsenal. And the scary part is, maybe some people that aren't nations have a nuclear arsenal. The largest bomb to date is 50 megatons, or in other words, 50 million tons of TNT. For example, that's 3,500 times more powerful than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. The average modern nuclear weapon yields approximately 600 kilotons to anywhere up to 22,000 or 2,200 kilotons, or 2.2 megatons. Imagine You remember that Hiroshima was only 12 to 14 kilotons. These things are hundreds of times more powerful. Tactical nuclear weapons, what they term as battlefield nukes. Tactical nuclear weapons are between 0.4 and 40 kilotons. In other words, they could be carrying a tactical weapon that's 3 times as powerful as the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. Back in 1983, Carl Sagan delivered a paper where he believed that a nuclear war would throw up enough ash and dust to block out the sun for years. He coined the term nuclear winter. And let's discuss if this can be possible. By the late 90s, the consensus was that it would be more like nuclear fall. In reality, enough nuclear explosions in our atmosphere could cause global temperatures to drop by 3 to 4 degrees C on average. And that could take effect for up to 3 years. The last ice age was only 6 degrees C. So Carl Sagan missed it a little bit, but not much. Okay? So we're talking about a major climate shift, plus radiation on top of it. Now, radiation occurs in something fallout. We don't call it fallout for one reason except this. When an atomic blast occurs, a cone of energy is shot down toward the ground, and then most of the material is ejected into the upper atmosphere. Okay, there's a gamma radiation burst coming down to ground, but most of the particulate matter, the radioactive particulate matter, is shot up into the stratosphere. And it falls out over the course of the next week to a year, depending on how high it wound up being in the stratosphere as it floats back down. Well, particles from a nuclear airburst can fall over the next 4 weeks to years. Some of them have half-lives that are relatively short. Okay? And they're not going to be causing major problems, but some of them have half-lives of 2 or 3 years. So it just depends on the type of fallout we get. Generally, you can come out of your bunker fairly safely in about 5 weeks. The longer you can shelter in place, the better, under as much dirt and concrete as you can find. Now, there are some things to look out for. Radiation sickness is a thing. We seldom ever see it aside from industrial accidents these days and times, but in the event of, say, a dirty bomb or a nuclear exchange or something like that, you could see radiation sickness. One of the first signs is nausea and vomiting. Then comes the diarrhea and headache. Fever comes along. Disorientation, a lot of times brought on by the fever, and weakness brought on by the fever. And then you could start bleeding out of both ends. You start throwing up blood and bleeding out of your bottom, and ladies could start bleeding, menstrual bleeding heavy. Hair loss, infections. You're so much easier to get an infection after you've been exposed to nuclear material. And low blood pressure. Those are the signs of radiation sickness. Now let's talk about the other stuff. There are lots of consequences after a nuclear incident. But please don't fall for the myths. There are a lot of myths out there that people will tell you about nuclear energy and nuclear radiation and things like that. The first myth is the movies and comic books seldom ever get it right. Okay? What you see in movies and comic books do not make you prepared for a nuclear incident. It just doesn't. So do your research. Pay attention to the civil authorities. Okay? It's going to save your life and maybe your family's life. Now, there's no pill. Another myth is there's no pill that's going to protect you from radiation. Okay? There's no pill that's going to protect you from radiation. There are some pills that will help you excrete any contamination you might have, but as far as the radiation itself, there's no pill to help that. You can't outrun it. You can't get in your car and go away faster than radiation travels. Radiation travels at the speed of light. Okay? It's a particle, but it's a wave at the same time. It's kind of an odd thing, like a light photon. It travels that speed. So you can't outrun it. Next, there's a difference between exposure and contamination. Exposure means that you've had radiation pass into your body. Contamination means that you have radioactive particles that are continuing to give off radiation. Okay, you have radioactive dust or pieces of uranium or pieces of beryllium or something like that on your body, little dusty pieces, doesn't have to be big, that you've either got on your body, you've inhaled, or you've ingested. Okay, that's contamination. That's a whole different animal from exposure. When you're exposed and you get away from the radiation, the exposure is over. When you're contaminated, you have that contamination until you remove those particles, and they are causing exposure every minute that you're contaminated. Does that make sense? The next myth is radiation goes on forever. Radiation does not go on forever. Each radioactive isotope is given off gamma radiation, but the reason it gives off gamma radiation is because it's losing nuclear components. Alright? That's the reason. I'm a physicist, and it gives off gamma radiation because it's losing nuclear components. So, it gives that radiation off, but eventually that element, and some of them have very long half-lives, but it reaches something called a half-life. And sometimes it gives off less and less and less as each half-life is achieved. Alright, so radiation decreases with time. That time may be a long time, or that time may be short, even 6 hours. Some radioactive elements, radioactive isotopes, I should say, instead of elements. Some radioactive isotopes have half-lives of only minutes, and some have half-lives of thousands of years. Okay, so that should give you some idea that radiation does not go on forever. There are some common sense things that you need to know when you're talking about an incident that involves radiation. For example, if you are in the area of something that is going to cause radiation, whether it's a nuclear incident at a power plant or a laboratory or maybe a dirty bomb, and I'll explain about dirty bombs in a minute. Let's say you're close to that. The smart, common sense things to do: immediately go inside. I don't care where you're at, go indoors. Don't stay outdoors, go indoors. Beta radiation can be blocked fairly simply. Gamma radiation is the real problem. Alpha radiation is the background radiation all over the place. So these radiation particles can be blocked, but they are not blocked by your shirt. Alpha particles blocked by your shirt, but we're exposed to alpha particles all the time. So get indoors. Indoors. Let me say that again. Immediately go indoors. Do not stay outside. Don't stay in a car. A car offers very little to no protection from radiation. Get to cover. Inside a concrete building, inside a wooden building even, is better than nowhere. Get as far away from the exterior walls as you can. Put as much material between you and the outside. That's what you have to do. Now, a basement's better. That puts a lot of dirt and concrete between you and the outside world. The more dirt and concrete you can put between you and the outside world in an event like this is super important. Now, close all the windows and doors and turn off any forced air heating systems. Because forced air, almost all of it, has some type of intake of outside air. Alright? So, turn that all off. Go to the basement, have the windows and doors shut, and take a radio with you. A small pocket radio, your cell phone, something. But chances are, that's not going to work in the basement. Okay? It won't work in my basement. So you need to have a radio down there so you can get instructions about what the next steps are. Most dirty bomb materials are going to dissipate within 24 to 48 hours because the materials that they use are not as radioactive as materials of immediately fusioned or fissioned bombs. Okay? It's going to be stuff like uranium ore and things like that. And once it's down on the ground, once the dust is settled and you're out of the contamination area, the dangerous radiation is probably going to dissipate between 24 and 48 hours. Okay, so you're not going to be in that basement forever. But you need to get somewhere out of the line of the dust and stop the dust from coming in. Turn that heating system off. Close those windows and doors. Okay? The exposure will go down and the civil authorities will notify you when it's safe to come out. So, again, that radio or contact to the outside world is going to be super important. Now let's talk about a nuclear exchange. Before we do that, I want to show you, we showed you how much the yields were for nuclear weapons, the average. I want to show you what that looks like on a map. Like I told you about before when we were talking, I said that cities of 100,000, well, the city of Lexington, Kentucky is about 300,000 people. That's the closest city to me that has 100,000 people or greater. Now, the average nuclear bomb is between 600 and 2,200 kilotons. So, what you're seeing on the screen right now is Lexington, Kentucky on a map. And the center circle is the fire radius. In other words, the center circle is how much would be completely destroyed. Now, this is a 600 kiloton nuclear bomb. Just 600 kilotons now. It would destroy almost all of downtown Lexington would be gone. It would just, everything would be annihilated. That's the fireball, the center circle. The outer circle is, or the yellow circle is the radiation. Anybody in that area is going to get third-degree burns to the bone. So those people are not going to fare very well either. And then the outer circle is the wind. Now, if you've ever watched the old atomic videos, the wind is pretty significant. And it's more than hurricane force winds all the way out in that outer circle. And you'll notice we've got Lexington, Kentucky in the center. It's almost all the way to the state capital of Frankfurt. Now let's see what happens when we go up to a 20 kiloton or a 20 megaton bomb, or in other words, 20,000 kilotons. Okay, here is a 20 megaton blast. You'll notice that most of the surrounding area of Lexington is going to be caught in the fireball. All the way out to the state capital of Kentucky, to Frankfort, is going to be third-degree burns all the way out. Then the wind damage will extend past the city of Frankfort. So you can see that a 20 megaton bomb is going to do some major devastation. This is probably going to kill 300,000 people. So these bombs carry a lot of energy, and it is important to pay attention. Now, most of the radiation from this bomb, after it's gone up into the atmosphere, where's it going to be deposited? Well, in the United States, the prevailing winds blow from west to east. So what you would be expecting to happen would be for the radioactive deposits to go to the east, to the northeast, or to the southeast. Now let's talk about a limited nuclear exchange. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I don't know if there could be such an animal. Okay? The United States and Russia, just two big boys, for example, have enough nuclear arsenal to destroy every city in both countries that have a population greater than 100,000. Okay? That's kind of a scary proposition when you think about it. If you live in a state, any city with 100,000 or more people could be a target. If there's a military installation anywhere around you, that's probably a target. So when you look at what we just did, showing you the size, you can kind of estimate what the bombs look like. Our prevailing winds are generally, for the most part, from the west, either going northwest, northeast, or southeast, or due east. Okay, so that would give you an idea of where the fallout is going to come. It all depends on weather. Now, most of the fallout's going to go up into the stratosphere because most of those bombs will not be ground impact. They will be exploding up into the air, and most of the nuclear material is going to go up into the stratosphere. It's going to fall out over the course of a week to a year. So think about those kind of things. Any military installation, and you can measure the distance, and you can see on our map that we showed you earlier how big that is. It is huge. All right? Even for a small nuclear blast. So a limited exchange, I don't know if you can have that. For years, the superpowers have lived under the assumption of assumed mutual nuclear destruction. In other words, if you hit us, we're going to hit you. Albert Einstein put it real succinctly when he said, I don't know about World War III, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Now, Crystal and I, we live about 6 miles from something called the Bluegrass Army Depot. And that's where the United States is destroying all of its chemical weapons stockpile. So you know they're going to send a big boy there. So me and Crystal, we get to go. Okay? We get to go. We're probably going to be in that secondary blast radiation area. So we probably get to go anyway. So that's what you have to look at to be assured of what's going to happen. Now, what if two countries other than the United States and Russia get in it? Okay? What if they're all the way on the other side of the world and they have a nuclear attack and they attack each other? Well, remember what I said about the radiation material. There's the gamma radiation shot down toward the ground. But most of the, I won't say most, but a lot of the radioactive particles go up into the stratosphere. And they're going to circle around the globe. So everybody is going to get the effects of that. Now, a small nuclear exchange in another country all the way on the other side of the world is probably not going to affect you and I that much. Just depends on where you live, okay? We saw some effects of Fukushima in California, but not much. A lot of people were blowing it way out of proportion to what it really was, but we saw some effects of that. Now, for the people that were exposed in Fukushima, for example, they're probably going to look at some increasing cancers and things like that in the next 10 years. Leukemias in children. Children are way more susceptible to radiation poisoning and sickness than their adult counterparts. But the radioactive material is going to fall over a wide range of areas. There's a lot of variables that you have to take into account. The payload, which our government will be able to assess that, but they're not going to tell me and you. So we won't be able to assess. We won't be able to assess that. But when we look at the U.S. and Russian arsenal, there's 13,300 and some bombs in the world. The U.S. and Russia account for all of those except 1,300. So all the other states around, or the nations, and I call them nation states, all of those have 1,300 bombs combined. Well, 1,300 bombs would probably bring on nuclear winter. As a matter of fact, depending on the size, I don't know how many it would take to bring about a cooling of the planet. Now, some have even proposed that that's a way we could cool the planet. But I don't know if you could depend on those estimates. I would be a little bit afraid of geoengineering at that level, so that would frighten me all to pieces. 20 or 30 of the big boys could cause a global crisis. Okay? 20 or 30 of the big boys could cause a global crisis. You can imagine what that would be like. Now, the big takeaways from this that you should get is that fallout takes sometimes a while to get here. But exposure to radiation makes us more susceptible to disease. The more concrete and ground you put between yourself and contaminated material, the better off you are. You've got to have stuff already in a shelter spot. If you're out and away from your shelter spot, your bug out bag or your get home bag should have in it a radio, a battery powered radio, and extra batteries. Okay? So that you can shelter in wherever you are. Don't shelter in a car. A wooden structure is better than a car. A concrete structure is better than wood, and dirt and concrete is better than a concrete structure. Radiation levels will drop over a course of weeks. It could be that if it's a dirty bomb, it might be a course of days. But if it's something else, it's going to drop in the course of weeks. At the first sign of trouble, don't delay. Don't mess around. Get to shelter. Those minutes could be a big difference. Get to shelter, get to shelter, get to shelter. Now, one of the things that accompanies a nuclear detonation, it's called an EMP, or an electrical magnetic pulse. Now, an electromagnetic pulse is something that's going to occur, and then after the explosion it's going to be over. So some machines will stop to work. The power grid might get overloaded and cause some problems for the grid to come back on. So the electricity might go out. How long it goes out depends on how strong the EMP was. But most things that are made of electronics and that kind of stuff will come back on. Most things. Not all things. For example, maybe that radio transmitter at the tower of a radio station may not come back on after an EMP. But your battery-powered radio might come back on. Does that make sense? So it might be important. It might be important to have a shortwave radio as well. One of the multifunction radios, because you can pick up shortwave information from around the globe. Your local radio station tower might be taken out, but a long distance station away from you still might be able to transmit. Okay, so a shortwave radio might not be a bad thing. If you get one of those radios that's shortwave, AM, and FM. Store some food in your shelter. If you have a planned shelter, store food in your shelter, because you may have to be there for 5 weeks. If you go out and fallout is occurring, you can become contaminated and take the radiation into the shelter with you. And if you take the radiation, radioactive particles, not the radiation, but the radioactive particles in the shelter with you, while you're away from most of it, you're still getting more by that way. So, you know the entire drill. I'm not going to sit here and tell you how to prep. But I am going to tell you that every minute counts when it comes to radiation exposure. Every minute counts. If you like this stuff, this homestead and do-it-yourself kind of thing, be certain to come on out to the channel and subscribe. We do this homestead and prepping stuff every week, sometimes 1, sometimes 5 videos. Just depends on what's going on in the homestead that week. Now, if you hit the little bell when you come to the channel, it'll notify you when we upload a video. We upload every Sunday. Now, with that being said, time for me to get on to the next thing.